Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. Now I'm totally befuddled and bemused, and I don't know if we even have the sound on.
You're bewitched, bothered, and bewildered. Yes,
it is. Yes.
There was no sound.
This is a safety warning for new viewers who may not be aware that I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving. I am especially conservative theologically. I want to know and believe what's true, and I'm willing to change what I believe if I am persuaded. So for those viewers who have a fear of hearing an idea which may lead to actually thinking and testing their beliefs, this is a trigger warning. This is not a safe space for those who may be easily offended by having their ideas challenged, or maybe by our satire. Today is October 13, 2020, and this is broadcast number 211. Professor, author of Racist Letter to a Racist Nation, Pull Yourself Together, America, is Dr. David Marshall, and he is a first-time guest. We tried to warn him in advance, but he will be shocked and amazed, I'm sure.
Yeah, he came anyway.
He is joining us to talk about critical race theory and culture on today's Unknown Webcast. My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our co-host, senior researcher, and former resident COVID-19 tracker is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie, baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm trees came out, saw their shadows, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsors for this installment of our webcast include the Grievance Industrial Complex, because things are never bad enough already, and Where's the Outrage, the game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. And if you enjoy our webcast, or if it really annoys you and you want to just inflict it on somebody else, to ensure continued access to this program, please go to MidwestOutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. That is what you should do.
Right, and don't forget to do that. David Marshall, PhD, is the author of Jesus is No Myth, The Fingerprints of God on the Gospels, and How Jesus Passes the Outsider Test for Faith. Interesting titles. He's a recent resident of coastal China. David was also hunkered down long-term in Japan, Taiwan, and England. I don't hope it wasn't all at the same time. As well as his native Seattle and adopted Southeast Alaska. He challenged the sex trade in East Asia, prayer biked across Taiwan, counted cod on a Russian fishing processor, and now acts as academic principal of Manal School in, I forget how to say that, Qingdao, yeah. David holds a BA in the Russian and Chinese languages and Marxism. How do you get a BA in Marxism? An MA in Chinese religions and a PhD in Christian thought and Chinese tradition. So it sounds like he's dying by degrees here.
Yeah.
He's now living in Washington State as author, and so he's challenging kind of the critical race theory. He also was, in addition to being an author, he challenged new atheism. David had debated publicly on atheism, the historical Jesus, the truth of Christianity, the future of China, and speaks in churches and other forums in a galaxy near you on many topics.
A galaxy near me.
A galaxy near you.
We used to drive a Ford Galaxy when we were a kid, but I don't think that's the same thing. I had trouble saying because I was in a Focus. So what's the outsider test? I haven't even taken the quiz yet. So what is the outsider test?
There was a book, A Popular Argument Against Christianity, popularized by a guy named John Loftus, who wrote about the outsider test for faith. And he said basically that the only reason we believe is because we're stuck within the well of our own culture, and we're raised to believe in a certain religious tradition. So if we go outside of that experience, outside of that cultural context, then we'll see how ridiculous our religion really is. But the difference between John and I was that John had never actually gone outside of American culture. He'd spent all his time, I think, in Indiana, basically.
This is the guy who wrote the book.
The guy who wrote the book that I'm responding to, yeah. In that
is he a structuralist by any chance?
I don't know what his deep philosophical perspective is.
The first thing I thought of was, I wonder if he's a structuralist. Everything is conditioned by your network of relationships.
Right. So my argument is in that book is that if you actually understand the history of religions and the anthropology of religions, then that actually gives you more reason to believe in Christianity, not less.
Yeah. How do we get all those Christians in China?
That was actually the subject of my first book.
And I understand that Christianity spent a lot of time in North Africa and the Middle East before it really made a huge dent in Europe, So what was it? Wasn't until the year 989 until Russia converted, right?
To be fair to John, his argument fairly new. There have been people who have been making that argument for a very long time, even going back to the ancient Greeks.
So in addition to being wrong, he's unoriginal, is what you're saying.
Aside from being wrong, he's also unoriginal. Yeah, put it that way. If you haven't had your cup of coffee this morning yet, and you're in a grumpy mood, because in Florida you don't have any mountains and it's always hot. Yes, I can understand you making that
argument. I have an article. I think it's from the New American, maybe. It's called "Did Slavery Create Prosperity?" It was written in 2019 by Doug Petricat. And it starts, recently, there seemed to be an increasing number of claims that American prosperity resulted from slavery. This is presented as justification for the renewed calls for reparations for slavery, which Democrats are using in an attempt to gain support as we approach the next presidential elections. But did slavery actually create the wealth of the U.S.? Does this claim have any historical basis in fact? Or is this a distortion of history to influence the views of voters?
Well, consider the fact that I think we'd actually paid our national debt down to something, I don't know, $600 million range, or I forget what it was, and we went from that to like $5 billion in national debt within five years. The entire economy of the South was destroyed during the war. We lost a whole generation of productive men. I think it came to fully 1/6 of the labor force of the South was killed in the Civil War, and not quite that percentage was killed in the North, but more men were killed. 100,000 more died from the North. Virtually all the wealth that was produced, I think, by 1900 had been produced between the war and 1900. So if slavery had produced wealth, most of it was destroyed.
Yeah. Well, we want to go over to David here because I do want to touch on his book. He grabbed my interest because he's in a discussion group on Facebook that you and I are part of as well on critical race theory. And he got into a discussion with one of the other members who will remain nameless.
I think I know which one, though.
Yeah, well, no, don't go there. And so I contacted David, and he was gracious enough to say, "Yeah, well, I'll be glad to come on and talk about these things." And then I discovered he had this book, "Letter to a Racist Nation: Pull Yourself Together, America." So my first question to you, David, is why did you write this particular book?
Why did I write the book? Let me first of all say a little bit about my background and what relationship it bears to this whole woke revolution that has occurred in 2020. First of all, I'm a graduate of the University of Washington, and I studied in the same quad, the same very leafy and beautiful part of of campus where Robin DiAngelo got her PhD, where she was studying whiteness studies. And of course,
then you really know what you're talking about. Then you must go ahead.
Well, I don't know if the leaves and the grass themselves come by osmosis, gave me that knowledge or not. But she was, I mean, that's the campus where this grew up, this idea, which is her book is maybe the best-selling book in the United States in 2020, even more than Ibram Kendi's book. And if you jump on the underground from the University of Washington campus, then one stop south is Capitol Hill, where the famous Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone was founded a few months ago, and then
Quickly,
kind of eventually went the way of the Roman Empire.
did they put a 14-year-old boy on the throne as the Visigoths were coming through, or what?
They put a couple teenagers into the grave.
Oh yeah, well that's sad. I don't want to talk about that.
Understandably. So that's one perspective. Another perspective is my brother is a 40-year veteran of police departments in the Seattle area, and so I grew up and continue to hear stories from him all my life, basically, about what police work is like. And I noticed I was extremely angry to see how the police were being scapegoated and over the last several months. It's continued to be. And I'm not even going to say the usual, there's bad apples in every barrel or something like that. But we all know that. I mean, there are bad podcasters. There's bad teachers.
Right.
We all know that.
But we don't know any personally, right?
Yeah. Of course, probably not. So from my personal perspective, as the brother of a police officer who has saved countless lives in numerous different ways, who loves God, and who's brokenhearted when he sees people's lives being destroyed, hearing his stories and then seeing how the police were just being cursed and abused, that was a little bit of some of the fire under me that really got me going with this book. But from a professional, scholarly perspective, I'm also a student of world cultures and world religions. And when I read Kendi and when I read D'Angelo, I recognized that they talked a lot about things I really didn't know very much about. In particular, one of their foundational ideas is that basically, if there are disparities between races, then those disparities must be explained in only one possible way, and that is by systemic racism.
Right.
But living outside of the United States and living among a variety of cultures, living among the tribal peoples of Taiwan, in a Shanti Jiahui, living in mainland China and Taiwan and Japan, going out into the ocean and doing flying fishing, catching flying fish with my wife's uncle, and living in Oxford and all those.
But that means you have actually valid cross-cultural experiences. We want to hear about your very narrow-minded, solely American, preferably white female invented things like, white fragility and white privilege.
Exactly. Race is not that important. What changes people's lives is culture. That is one of the main ideas in my book. Cultures and subcultures. Human beings are not determined by the color of their skin. And it's very strange that we seem to be resurrecting that old idea in 2020. It's rather sad and pathetic that we're doing that. But of course, disparities are created by people's choices. To give a very simple example, different races in the United States have different life expectancies. It's not because of their race, it's not because of their skin color, and it's not because of discrimination. Mostly it's because of what people choose to eat. If you like to sit down on the couch and watch a football game while eating Twinkies and chips and Coke, that's not a healthy lifestyle, and you're not going to live as long as somebody who's eating like a Japanese kind of cuisines. So those are very simple examples of how culture influences outcome. The choices that we make, individually or collectively, influences how our lives are going to be lived.
I'm personally pretty upset by the fact that, that men are 93.2% of the prison population. We are definitely disproportionately represented. And I think the only explanation for that is persecution against males. What would you say? I mean, you got 93%, and as opposed to less than 7% are women in our prison population. If there's ever an argument for disproportionality, I would say these statistics are just screaming at us, aren't they?
Well, the only time I was arrested was for smuggling Bibles. So I don't know what the gender disparity is with that.
It's like when you find a disparity, you therefore have to find an oppression, some kind of systemic oppression that causes it. Except if we're talking about males, especially white males. Now, of course, what they'll do next is let's say, well, yeah, 93.2% of the prison population is male. Now let's talk about which percentage is African American.
Yes, and this is one of the odd things about this whole movement is you even hear from, say, Cory Booker, for example, or from other public figures, mainly LeBron James, for example. They will say something like, we're so afraid we have to teach our children the dangers of encountering the police. Our sons and our daughters are in danger every time they leave the house. That is scaring the heck out of people. And
it's not even true.
It's utterly ridiculous. Not even from the perspective, as I'm sure we all realize, that only a few dozen people are killed. Let me put it this way. This is one of the analogies that I use in the book. If you look at the Scientific American, they did a study of errors in the health professions, and they found that something like 300 or 400,000, not 300 or 400 people, 300 or 400,000 Americans die every year because of medical errors.
Wow.
300,000, 400,000.
That's more than have died of COVID so far, and maybe will die of COVID. Definitely more than will die in 2020.
The relevant comparison is that means that something like 3,000 people are killed, Americans are killed every year by medical errors, by the medical profession.
3,000 or 300,000?
No, I'm doing a comparison.
Oh, okay.
3,000 people per person who is killed by errors by the police.
Okay.
But we're not burning down hospitals, and we shouldn't burn down hospitals because we have a little bit of sense still when it comes to hospitals. But what is really going on here?
We should burn down Walter Reed because they cured Trump.
Don't give any. Now you were saying podcasters are good people. You better be careful there. No, but here's a relevant. Had a thought though. Here, why is it that the police are being scapegoated in this way? And that's one of the things that got me thinking from a perspective of the history of world religions. And it hasn't always been police that have been scapegoated like that. In past eras, we've had the Jews have been scapegoated, blacks have been scapegoated. 100 years ago, lynchings. Right. During the Soviet era, after World War II, Joseph Stalin scapegoated the doctors. So doctors have been scapegoated in the past. During the Cultural Revolution, Chairman Mao, and then later on the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, scapegoated who? Teachers.
Yeah, the Cultural Revolution, college professors were dragged sometimes out of their classrooms, beaten. It's like a scene out of a Woody Allen movie where they take the glasses off their face, throw them on the ground, and stomp on them. I think that was from Take the Money and Run. It's like they were. Well, anyways, it's. I've read a lot about the Cultural Revolution, and it sounds so much like what's going on now. It's scary.
Well, here's the kind of the theoretical perspective that I look at this from. There is a French, I don't know if I call him an anthropologist or a literary anthropologist. He is a member of the Académie Française or whatever it's called.
That's what it's called, Académie Française.
His name is, I don't know if you've heard of him or not, René Girard.
Yeah, sounds familiar, but I can't make the connection.
Girard was interested in violence, not doing violence himself, not committing violence. Otherwise he would probably have joined with like the 20% of the Occupy Wall Street people who were teachers.
Or he'd live in Portland, so
be a good place. Yes, René Girard was not interested in that way. He was trying to understand why people committed violence in mass groups, and He wrote many books on this subject, and one of his most famous books was called Scapegoating. He said that this is how he described the establishment of a new state. First, you've got what you call tensions. You've got mimetic violence. In other words, people are copying each other and becoming more angry because there's some good that they're all seeking for and they can't all have. So you have factions in society. And then at some point, there is a crisis. There is a foreign invasion or a pandemic or some other sort of crisis in society. And that crisis causes the people to focus their anger and their fear on one particular group in society. Now, how do they choose that group?
Well, if they read a book by Hitler, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. There's often a theoretical foundation before that, like the hammer of witches in the Middle Ages.
It's like only 1% of the German population was Jewish in 1936.
1%. That's very important.
600,000 Jews in all of Germany, and yet they were somehow responsible for all the problems. So
yes, and that 1% is actually a figure that was used by Stalin when he set quotas for how many people were to be arrested. I understand. And 1% is also the figure that Howard Zinn uses when he talks about the rich. And then, of course, Occupy Wall Street
1%,
came back to that 1% figure. So now police there are about 700,000 police in America. So they're less than 1%. But if you include their families and whatnot, you might get close to that figure. I don't know if it was, I suppose, here's what happened. Of course, everybody knows that for the last 4 years, the Democrats have tried their best to get rid of the guy with yellow hair.
They made a couple of tries at it, a couple of stabs at it.
Now, I'm not going to say, I'm not I'm a huge fan of Donald Trump, but it's pretty obvious.
I'm not really.
Yeah.
He wasn't my first choice. Let me put it that way.
But for the last 4 years, here's my 17th choice out of 17, actually. For the last 4 years, one racist incident after another has occurred across the United States, and I document these, which turned out not to be racist incidents at all.
Oh, have you followed Andy Nago's Twitter thread about that?
Bit. I haven't followed his thread, but I know who he is.
He's got a thread just devoted to racism hoaxes. Racist attack. I mean, it was like it went on and on and on. So go ahead.
So here's the point that has to do with scapegoating. Scapegoats, first of all, you have to find a group of people who are plausible foils, yes, targets, and they can be either they have to be separate from the community at large in some ways, either as something really down, the poor, the wretched, foreigners, or they can be something really brilliant and really amazing, like a superstar, a king, or something like that. Some of the early examples in Greek mythology of scapegoats are actually kings, like Pentheus, for example, the king of Thebes. So first of all, you find your group, and secondly, you have to ascribe to them some terrible sin which is completely outside of the bounds of civilization. And in fact, it's a sin that's so grave, like cannibalism or incest, that it threatens the very foundations of civilization. Now, if you look around America today, there is a famine of racists.
Yeah, it's like Thomas Sowell said, racism isn't dead, but it's on life support. It's being kept alive by a whole bunch of liberals who are trying to basically divide the country.
Well, it's not just to divide the country. It's because they need a sin that's so vile that they can scapegoat a certain group of people. And over the last 4 years, you can see again and again the attempt to invent racists, often from whole cloth. Sometimes it turned out to be a Halloween hoax by a friend. Sometimes it turned out to be just kind of an ambiguous grin by a high school Catholic student, or anything it takes.
Well, a microaggression, the kind you have to like put under a microscope to see, but once they're
But it's important. Those are important
to them.
They're vital.
It's like the kind of things that happen to everybody in relationships, but for some reason, as soon as it happens between people of two different racial backgrounds, suddenly takes on this whole new significance. And, I get that. I mean, if I try to be fair, I'll say, okay, we have a racial context. Our culture has a racial context, and a lot of bad things have happened. And you meet everybody you meet. There seems to be a certain percentage of people who live in such an echo chamber bubble that nothing seems to penetrate in or out. So you'll have some white people who are convinced that either Jews or blacks are trying to destroy America. And no matter how much evidence you give them that this is not the case, they will continue living in that little echo chamber bubble, processing out all the conflicting evidence and only assimilating the stuff that's in a way that conforms to their presuppositions. And likewise, I have met African Americans who do the same thing. They're convinced that
there's people in every group that do that kind of a thing, and they start off with an idea that correlation is causation. I can see something happening, and I can see, well, okay, blacks are having a difficult time in education, especially in the inner cities, and there's a lot more whites in this country than there are blacks. Therefore, whites are causing the lack of education.
What we're seeing now is thanks to I don't know how many decades of indoctrination, we're seeing a new breed of white person, mostly. I mean, you look at these protests, they've got to be 80 to 90% white people.
Right. Antifa especially.
Depends on the city.
Does that sound like an accurate?
I think in Portland probably, but in Louisville it's probably much more African American. It depends on the city.
But in Louisville, how much violence is going on? Is as much as Portland?
Louisville's not my problem. I live in the Northwest.
So it's not your problem. You don't need to know. It's a need to know basis. Well, okay. So what I'm saying is there's this new breed of white person who is convinced that by the things that we said at the beginning, that all the wealth of America was built on slavery, when in fact, did we talk about this before the show started or after it started?
You talked about it at the beginning of the show.
Right. At the beginning of the show. Yeah.
So in other words, how plausible is that thesis? No, well, you don't question it. It's just you don't. You
just assume it's true.
You read the 1619 Project in the New York Times, and you assume it's all true, even when the author herself says, "Well, it's not really history. It's just
the more important point." I mean, what you said was very useful and important, I think. But there's another point that I think needs to be kept in mind as well, and that is what it is that creates wealth. And I know that Thomas Sowell is someone popular in conservative circles, but another person that I'd recommend would be Rodney Stark in his book on the origins of capitalism. It's not slavery can produce wealth for some people, and even conquering and pillaging enemy territory, like that's how the ancient Athenians made most of their loot, and that's how the Spanish made a lot of their money too, just by the sheer act of conquering somebody who has a lot of bling. But the manufacture, the creation of wealth is something that capitalism is particularly prone to do, and that begins very much with the in some of the estates of northern Italy in the Middle Ages, and then passed into Holland, and then later on to England, and then to the United States, and now is very much alive in places like China and India. The creation of wealth does not depend. In fact, some people would argue that slavery can become a barrier to the creation of wealth in the long run.
Right. Well, all right. Now I want to mention your book again here so people can see it, and they can go. We have a link at the bottom of in our description. You can go right there and order it. And then Ron has not told me the order of things, so we're going to have to go from here to a short break. But the book is Letter for a Racist Nation, Pull Yourself Together, America, by David Marshall. I would recommend getting it. I think in light of what we see going on right now, that would be helpful. Ron, you are on.
I try to stay on. Well, recently in an emergency meeting at the Toxico Corporation, But the project lead, Stu, said, these protests are delaying the project and killing our bottom line. Well, Foreman Larry said, all this over a few million dead fish. And PR spokesperson Pam said, yeah, we're the real victims here. Meanwhile, across town, a hedge fund manager consults with his lawyer. He says, I feel so left out of the culture wars. I can't afford to be left behind. But where do I find the right victim status to bring me the professional success I'm looking for? Meanwhile, Phil is meeting with his career counselor, and he says, I've come to the point where I realize I don't have enough intersectionality on my resume. Do you think I should consider gender reassignment surgery to boost my job prospects? Well, now there's a solution for all these problems at the Grievance Industrial Complex. The Grievance Industrial Complex is the premium manufacturer and recycler of fine grievance products. It provides grievances customized for your political, economic, and social goals and works closely with you throughout the design and implementation process to ensure your satisfaction. And all Grievance Industrial Complex products come with free moral high ground, the patented moral high ground, which includes victim status, identity politics tactics, flawless far left ideology, and so much more. And free for a limited time, you get a copy of Playing the Victim Card for Terrorists, which, according to Dr. S.W.J.W. Jones, is even better than the Harry Potter series. The Grievance Industrial Complex, because things are never bad enough already. So, check it out.
Check it out. So one of the questions that came in while we were on a minute ago, and does really bear on why we want to do this, because we're talking about a cultural problem, but it is one that the church has decided to embrace. And so the question that came in was thoughts on, is from Richard Neal. What is y'all's thoughts on evangelicals supporting critical race theory?
Yeah, we got to do that.
I think we do need to touch on that for sure. And to be honest, Ron is more informed on this than I am. He has been following it for a few years. Dr.
Marshall's more informed than I am on this.
Absolutely. Dr. Vodi Balkum has been dealing with it for 10 years. It came to my attention really just last year with the Southern Baptist Convention trying to decide whether they embrace it or not, because you have one faction saying, yes, this is true, we need to do our theology based on this, and the other side going, no, we got to stay with Scripture.
Well, it was called Resolution Number 9, which was a Beatles song on the White Album until they took the V out of it and put an S in it. So but according to I think the main sticking point is there enough of substance that is useful in critical race theory that we can call it an analytical tool? This is what the resolution was setting forth. And my good friend Tom Askell, who lives not far from here, is adamantly opposed, and I don't blame him. They're trying to get this resolution overturned. So this is one place where it's making a deep inroad. We see it. I think we see it in my own denomination, the PCA, although it's been kind of overshadowed by the revoice controversy. So, Dr. Marshall, what do you say? What say ye to this?
Well, first of all, about the grievance industry.
Industrial complex.
Industrial complex, yes. I really think that bald people have been oppressed down through the centuries.
I feel it. I'm tired of people saying that they know what it feels like, because they don't.
Yes.
I think that's a microaggression.
And I'm oppressing you too. So.
Should evangelicals buy or use critical race theory as a template for discovery? Now, I tend to think, because I have written on Christianity and world religions, I tend to think there's a little bit of truth in almost every ideology, even ones that I really despise, like Marxism. And even probably in Nazism, you can find a few truths knocking about here or there if you look hard enough. I think Adolf Hitler was a friend of dogs, for example.
Yeah, like German Shepherds, you love
kind of dogs. Well, I tend to agree with him on that one. The question, though, is not primarily should evangelicals support critical race theory? The question is, first of all, should Christians support critical race theory? And secondly, should human beings support critical race theory? Yeah. And what amazes me is how shallow the philosophical roots of popular ideologies are in our day today. And the wealth that we have in the gospel of Jesus Christ by comparison. Read the Gospels, for crying out loud. Read how Jesus interacted with people. That's where we should be obtaining our wisdom.
These people would say that that's what CRT does.
So no, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Okay, I'm just telling you what they're saying.
Jesus is now. Here's the truth you might find, because everything that is true in critical race theory does come from the gospel eventually, such as we should be concerned for people on the margins. We should, in fact, the gospel has done more for women than anything else in history.
Right.
The gospel has done more for people who are persecuted, for people who were burnt to death, women who were burnt to death in India, women who had their feet bound in China, people who didn't have access to education before.
Women who were strangled to death when their husbands died in Fiji. That was a tip. All these things, when your husband died, you must die too. These were pervasive in non-European Christian cultures, which we're told that Eurocentrism is a bad thing. Well, it seems to me that once Europe got Christianity, things got better.
So where does that all come from, though? I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
And I'm working on a book right now with friends around the world in 6 different continents. We're working on a book that's trying to remake the whole education, try to create a revolution in education. Why? Because Jesus Christ was a teacher. Mm-hmm. And the way that he taught is something that we can learn from today. Jesus' very casual response to somebody he meets on the streets goes much, much deeper than the PhD by Dr. Robin DiAngelo will ever go. For example, when Jesus meets a lawyer, the lawyer says, what can I do to make it to heaven? And Jesus says, well, you know the law. He sums it up. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who is my neighbor? Well, that's the key question that we are asking today in America. Who is my neighbor? And mm-hmm. Jesus gave us a total story to tell us who is my neighbor, who that neighbor is. And it doesn't, okay, so a man is walking down the road to Jericho, and he gets mugged by some robbers who are living in the caves nearby. A Samaritan man, a person of another race, another culture, hostile to the Jews, happens upon the Jew, and he gets off his donkey, gets off his ass, if you might put it, okay. And helps this man, pays his bill, cleans him up, puts him in a hotel. So Jesus is saying, first of all, okay, yes, Christian love should cross those barriers to people who are other races, of other professions, of other gender, the other gender. Yes, Christians should care about those who are marginalized. This is all true, and this is the kernel of truth in critical race theory. But Jesus's story goes so much deeper than critical race theory does. Because here, who is that other guy? Is that guy that's been mugged or been beaten on the side of the road? Maybe he's a cop. You can't say beforehand who that person is going to be. It could be anybody of any race, of any, ideology or whatever. The person that you meet, that is the person that you're responsible to treat kindly, boldly. Because, 100 years ago, Black people were being lynched in the South. Nowadays, we have to look at what's going on around us today, because things change. And that's one of the lessons of the Cultural Revolution in China. The people who were persecuted in the Cultural Revolution, maybe their parents really were doing bad things. Maybe they really were oppressors and capitalists and landlords who were being nasty to their tenants. That's all possible. But the Cultural Revolution was a revolution. It was a new time and a new place. Mm-hmm. And in that situation, you don't look around, you don't judge people by their category. That is the sin of critical race theory, judging people by their category, their whiteness or their blackness or whatever.
Right.
One thing I think about a lot is I see a lot of equivocation fallacies in mostly on the CRT side of the argument. In fact, almost virtually completely for instance, we bring up the word systemic every once in a while. And it seems to me that, well, some people, there are different, some people will say something like this, that when you see all this racism, it's there by design. It's designed to, the system is designed to be racist. So when you talk to these people, I understand them to be using the word systemic according to the dictionary definition. In other words, there is a system. It is designed and it functions accordingly, according to that design. Now, the problem, of course, is that when we had things, institutions like Jim Crow, when we had actual segregation, legalized segregation, when we had, tests for voting and poll taxes and things like that, they were all designed to exclude African Americans from the polling place, as well as poor whites, by the way, in many cases. That there was an actual tangible, so to speak, system that you could point to and say, see, there it is. It's encoded. It's embodied in law. So now you have to posit a system. You have to say that the system somehow exists, even though it's not really organized in any formal fashion. It is simply there. So some people, though they believe it's there, they're using the word systemic according to the dictionary. But then when you point out these problems to some people and say, well, look, where are the segregation laws? Where are all the accoutrements and where's the apparatus of systemic racism that we saw up until the 1960s? They start to slide into a different meaning of the term. And so for them, the word systemic becomes more like the word pervasive. They just keep on appealing to how, well, you have a story here, you have a story there. It's all over the place. It's pervasive. And I'm totally willing to grant that racism might be pervasive to the extent that there are still a lot of racists in our culture. They're still out there. I don't know how many there are. I don't know if we
of
can.
All colors.
And I don't know.
Of all colors, right.
Right. And I don't know if we can know how many they are, because being racist is so unpopular that people tend to hide it. They tend to camouflage it.
Yeah, some people tend to, others do
Some
not.
people.
One of the problems that we have, and it's a problem with who controls the language. You and I have talked about this before.
Absolutely.
Who controls the language controls the narrative. So racism, not all that long ago, was simple. It was if you treated someone of a different color, ethnicity, whatever, badly, you were a racist. Now they have expanded the definition to exclude themselves from racism,
right? Well,
by saying it has to be the group that has the power, a power group.
Prejudice plus power. That was
prejudice plus power. Right.
I encountered that in the early 90s and late 80s, early 90s in the liberal seminary where I worked. Right. I never really thought it would take root in the culture, but sure enough, it did.
So I don't want to go too far afield. I want to come back to David here and try to go through the numbers on his book here.
And the chapters, yeah. Well, just one more thing. This is about racism, and that is, if you have this problem with actually identifying what systemic racism is, and then at the same time you say, let's eliminate racism. Okay. All right. How do you eliminate something that you can't point to, that you can't say, here it is, it's right here? Well, of course they say it's everywhere. Well, so now we have to dismantle everything. Okay, if every white person is racist, then the only way to dismantle it is to put every single white person through a struggle session, and that's what they want to do.
Well, you have what Buddy Balcom calls cultural, not cultural, cultural Gnosticism,
right?
Cultural Gnosticism, where if you're a person of color, I guess that's the current terminology. You can read into someone's facial expression, as you pointed out, and go, oh, I know what they're really thinking. So you have this intuitive knowing, which maybe they just had gas. I mean, it could be a lot of reasons why maybe that's just how their face looks. I know some people just
Right.
always look angry.
But who are you
And
to
I-
question the victim? Because
Well, right, and I
because
thought they
just
were always
know.
angry, and then I realized that's just how their face looks. There's nothing
Right.
to do with that. So, so David, I need to grab this back here and say, as we're going through this, the question we're just talking about is America racist? Yes, no. You commented on your book. What do you say?
Yes, no, and yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
First of all, what is racism? If racism means what Kendi says, and let me grant Kendi this good quality. That one thing that I like about his book, I actually like his book better than D'Angelo's book. He seems more human. Kendi expresses a lot of appreciation and delight in the African American culture, and that's something that I'm not. I'm coming from a different kind of an international perspective, but I appreciate it when people really delight in their cultures. And I think that we should, affirm all the good things that African American culture has provided for to America and to the Western world, along with Native American culture and other cultures. I think that having lived in a place like Taiwan, which is just an amalgam of different cultures of the Japanese and the 10 different tribal peoples and the Minnan Chinese and the Minnan speaking Chinese, the Hakka speaking Chinese, and the mainland Chinese. It's a delight to see all those cultures working together. Although they often have friction, there's also often tension. And the mountain people did used to come down to the lowlands and chop people's heads off. That was part of their culture. So cultures have their beauties. And it's frustrating to me to see people reduce everything to such a simplistic cartoon state. We should be celebrating the beauties of the cultures, but we should also recognize that cultures can suffer harm too and be degraded, especially by ideas, because ideas are what create cultures to a large extent. Also, of course, cuisines that are based on local foods and whatnot. But
Yeah.
ideas are very, very important in creating cultures. And right now we have a war between different ideas in the African American community and in the American culture, civilization at large, between different ideas. My opinion is that the complex of ideas, which is called critical race theory, is a very harmful. It's based on false premises for the most part, not completely, and it's also a very harmful ideology, not just for American culture as a whole, but also to African American culture, because there are voices in the African American community that I think, are talking more sense about some of the issues and the problems that different communities in America face.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
I'm sorry. So let me get back to that. Yes, no, yes.
You get back to it. Yeah.
If you define racism the way that Kendi defines racism, then we'll never get rid of racism. It's eternal. And that's kind of the dream of the left. They need racism. If you define racism in the traditional way, there are a few people. We all have sins of our own. We all prejudge people and along a lot of different lines. I just mentioned as a joke, bald people. Well, some people don't like bald people or fat people or people of this kind or people of that kind. Right. We all have those kinds of prejudices in them, and we'll never get rid of them completely. And yes, some of them might be racial, or probably more of them are cultural than they are racial. So there's a small amount of that on all sides. But I don't think American culture is fundamentally racist as it used to be. Now, the third yes is that American culture is becoming more racist. And it is because of critical race theory, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I think it's what critical race theory is doing is it's introducing a new kind of racism, an anti-white racism, and it's spurring a reaction among white people. It's bringing out latent racism that has been here the whole time within the white community. They're reacting to what they're seeing happening. And you're starting to see some of the old badness among, Caucasians reemerging in response to this.
But the most important thing for Christians to remember is that racism is not the only sin.
Right.
And it's amazing to me that America seems to think it is right now. Why do we focus on this one sin? Partly for the reason I just mentioned, in order to scapegoat certain classes of people. But the other reason is to cover up other sins, which people would rather not.
So you think it's kind of like a fig leaf type of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, we clothe ourselves with what looks good on the outside, even though it doesn't even address what the sin was that was committed in the first place.
Right, right.
You talk about culture, and I taught social studies for 8 years at the middle school level, but they pretty much hew the line on what the sociological definition of culture is. They just bring it down to a middle school level. So you're talking about cultures include things like language, arts, behavioral norms, but a really important part of culture is values and beliefs. And values, of course, we tend to look toward American values of freedom of speech, freedom of, the freedoms that we want to have. But beliefs, now you're starting to get a little dicey here, because we're a nation of pluralistic beliefs. So I think one of the problems, one of the sneaky things that critical race theory does is it smuggles in a new belief system. So I'd like to ask you, how closely aligned is this CRT belief system with Marxism? How justified are we?
We want to get to that question. We need to hold it for a second. I want to mention his book while Ron gets ready for the next little commercial. Letter for a Racist Nation, Pull Yourself Together, America, by David Marshall. You can go to a link in the description and order that up. It's pretty inexpensive, $3.99 on Kindle. I like that. And Ron, take us away.
Take you away. Well, you should be taken away. Well,
I know. I agree.
So we have some questions here. The first one being, have those boring family dinners just become unbearably tedious for you? Do you wonder when someone will invent a board game that gives your life a real purpose? Do you want to be part of something bigger than yourself while remaining the center of your universe? Then we have just what you're looking for. Where's the outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. And where's the outrage? There are no unfair inequality promoting dice. The rules for taking turns are very simple. Each player gets points for being in an oppressed group, and then turns are taken in order of the most points. Next, you choose a bankroller, also known as the game's George Soros. The George Soros distributes the game cards, and now you're ready to play. So each player chooses a game piece, places it on the forward space, and in this game, Briannold, who is an African-American, Native American, non-binary, transgendered, former female, whose pronouns are Marx, Engels, and Lenin, gets the first move, and Briannold, whose pronouns I will not use, decides to go to the Christian-owned bakery, where Briannold pulls a free lawyer's card and then occupies the space. And now Briannold is free to make another move. And let's say Briannold's move takes Briannold to the free speech zone. Well, Briannold will just take one of those entitlement cards to blow off those fascist white supremacists and their stupid free speech. Yes, the fun is just beginning in Where's the Outrage, the game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. So it's fun for the whole family. And
how many points do bald people get? I didn't hear that part.
and it actually will disrupt your nuclear family if you play it. So that is one of the intended consequences of the game. So I was asking before then, is it too early to bring it back in, or did you want to go somewhere else?
Let's do it.
Because about a year ago, when CRT was barging its way into churches, there was already a brewing discussion about cultural Marxism, and you had a whole bunch of people come out. I have a bibliographical list it's not huge. There's about a half a dozen books going back to the early '80s, all with the words cultural Marxism in their titles. Okay, in other words, it was a thing. Cultural Marxism exists. It's there. And yet there were New York Times articles saying it's a figment of the imagination. It's created by the alt-right. So I don't even have that discussion anymore. What I do instead is I try to go to a different discussion, which is, now that we're looking at critical race theory by itself, how closely related is it to Marxism, or is it?
Well, first, a little background on myself on this question. I studied for my BA. I studied under Dr. Donald Treadgold, who was the head of the history department at the University of Washington, just off of the same quad where Robin DiAngelo got her PhD. And he was a student. He was the editor of the Slavic Review, which was a magazine that reviewed. He also taught the history of communism. So I was very interested in the subject, and that's what I did for my BA, basically. Not critical race theory in those days, but Marxism and its relationship to Russian and Chinese languages. And I used to go up to class at Gould Hall, I think it was, maybe a different building, the oldest building on campus where the anthropology department was. And I took a communist philosophy class from a practicing revolutionary who, his class, this is many years ago now, late 80s, his class was kind of a microcosm of the critical race, the whole intersectional.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, everybody was there. Everybody was there. There were the gays.
He was a practicing revolutionary. He still didn't have it down yet. He had to keep
No,
yeah.
No, he wasn't practicing very well because one of the students at the University of Washington got killed in Nicaragua. So he brought black armbands for us to wear. I didn't put mine on because I was the contra, the class contra.
You were the token, yeah.
Yeah, I was the guy. I was arguing with the professor all the time, but I give him credit because he didn't give me the worst grade that I got at the University of Washington, even though I argued with him all the time. Anyway, Marx was never Marx was always wrong. Everybody had to reinvent Marx in order to make their theory work. Vladimir Lenin's version of Marxism was not really spot on either. And then Stalin further perverted it, as did Mao Zedong. I mean, Mao Zedong had a nation of agricultural workers, peasants. Well, Marxism didn't predict revolution among the peasants. It predicted revolution among the workers. They didn't have enough workers in China to make it go, so he had to rely on the peasant class, which had always been revolting anyway. I mean,
so the revisionism started very early.
So there is no such thing as pure communism, not because people are so perverse that they keep on messing up communism. It's because communism is so perverse that it can't be put into effect in the state that Karl Marx actually described. In the case of Mao Zedong, he changed it for the focus from workers to peasants. In the case of critical race theory, it changes the focus from workers or class to race or gender or other ways of looking at things. And you can see that evolution. I mean, I'm not necessarily an expert on that history, but you can see it in Zinn, for example, Howard Zinn, in his People's History of the United States. You can see
so-called history, yeah.
So-called history, yes. Not very good history, but very good for understanding the origins of critical race theory and how it became popular on American campuses. Because Howard Zinn became a professor, first of all, at a Christian college in Atlanta called Spelman. And he was very controversial there at first because he wasn't a Christian. He had great credentials from Columbia University, but he wasn't a Christian. And he, at the time, he recognized that, this was during the civil rights era, and he joined in with his African-American students to try to press for civil rights, quite understandably at the time. But it was also rather opportunistically. And then when he went on to New England and he became a professor at Brown University, you can see that continued emphasis. For example, there's a high school, I don't remember, something in Latin High School, which is just a few minutes walk from Harvard University. And Matt Damon and his brother Kyle went to school there when they were in high school. And so did, by a twist of fate, the Boston Bombers also went to that school.
Is that a private school?
I think it. I'm not sure.
Okay.
It's a big school. It's got like 2,000 or 3,000 students, and it's
Okay.
only like 5 or 10 minutes from Harvard by foot. Larry Aronson basically did your job there, Ron. He was the social science teacher and the history teacher at that school. And he was also a personal friend of the older of the Boston Bombers, who was one of his neighbors. He was also a personal friend of Howard Zinn, who was a neighbor to two other brothers, Matt and Kyle Damon. Now, Larry Aronson very deliberately tried to introduce Howard Zinn's curricula into his school, and it was very successful at it. And later on, in later years after his retirement, would brag about the hundreds of people who, got into this field of his graduates who got into the field later on professionally, and also all the different, demonstrations and whatnot that they held. And all of that was focused not on class consciousness, but more on, gender and immigrants and race theory. So basically, it's a very opportunistic form of Marxism, and it's a very evolutionary form of Marxism, which recognizes, first of all, that as with Marxism, as in classical Marxism, the focus is not on the individual, as it was with Jesus when he told the story of the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan is walking down. He sees an individual who's in need.
Mm-hmm.
The focus is on the group.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, it's a very naive sort of group morality, because it basically takes these groups as fixed in their character, and also doesn't understand that power dynamics also change over time. In some contexts, the Jew who was mugged might have been the powerful person. He might have been a lawyer, he might have been a Pharisee or something like that. Yeah. But in this particular context, he was no longer the powerful person. And one of the problems with critical race theory is that it doesn't recognize the fluidity and complexity of power dynamics in every society.
Right.
In some contexts, the little old Hispanic lady at McDonald's with her mop is the source of power. She tells you where she's mopping, and you get out of her way. She has the power in her hands.
Yeah.
Or her daughter maybe has a child. Well, in the mother-child relationship, the mother is naturally going to have more power. All of us have power. All of us have power.
Just as an example of what you're talking about, the liberal seminary where I worked at had a 20% enrollment of students from Spanish-speaking countries. So when they had Hispanics, they weren't just American Hispanics. They were from Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Puerto Rico. We had one from Barcelona. I ran into this issue where I'm a student accounts guy. That's what I did. I managed the accounts in the beginning, and I took on a few more responsibilities later. I was told by an American Hispanic who worked and helped me with translation issues. She says, Ron, I don't think you realize how intimidating you are to our Hispanic students. And I go, what are you talking about? Because I try to be, Don, would you say that I'm the kind of guy who tries to intimidate people?
I can say that if you want me to.
I try to think of myself as a guy who tries to at least appear to be safe to be around and not intimidating. But what I learned was,
were you wearing a necklace of skulls around your neck or something like that?
No, what I learned that from these cultures, to go into an office and to deal with people on an official level right away, that gave me this aura of authority, that they didn't realize how low I was on the totem pole of authority. And all I could do, I didn't have, I did have the power to not sign their registrations if they were behind in their student accounts. And if I didn't sign it, that meant they couldn't register. But they could always go around the corner to my boss and work out a deal and get around that. It was not like I had this, I was more like the Wizard of Oz in terms of power. I also learned that there's this tremendous fear of the police. And I found this out. This was repeated over and over again in experiences I had later we had an Hispanic pastor in our church, and there was a genuine bona fide fear of dealing with the police because in their countries, the police are corrupt. The police will abuse you. The police will try to get money out of you. So just going into a police department to maybe just fill out some paperwork would scare the daylights out of some of them.
Well, I'm sorry.
No, so these are cultural differences that it's almost like they're coming from a different planet sometimes.
Okay.
Well, this is actually a point that I bring up in the book, is because my brother is a police officer, and I did research on the 1,000 Americans who are, according to some sources like The Guardian, are killed by police every year. And, if you look into the stories, you read the stories, it is hard for me to imagine somebody reading those stories. And I looked up the different online newspapers and whatnot, and media sources that told the stories of exactly what happened. Sometimes you could watch the actual video of the shooting. There were very, very few, almost no cases in which I would say, wow, those cops are really going out to cause trouble for people. It was most of the people were armed. Most of them were men. Most of them, about a third of them were committing some sort of a large percentage of them were committing some violent crime as a part of their job. That was their job. They're career criminals. Another part were people who had lost their mental awareness through drugs or through mental illness, or a combination of the two. And then there was another big category of people who were beating on their wives or their girlfriends, or trying to shoot a neighbor or something like that. There are a very small percentage, very small number of people who were very ambiguous. It's hard to say, well, should those police really have done what they did? Maybe they reacted too quickly, but that was more the case of reacting too quickly than being just trying to go out and hurt people. However, if you look at Brazil, for example, the United States has 1,000 killings by police a year. Brazil has thousands. And it's a smaller country. It's, like 2/3 the size of the United States. It has like 5,000 or 6,000 killings a year by police.
Really?
Yeah. But of course, if you look at from another perspective, the murder rate is also much higher in Latin American countries. I think this has to do, going back to culture, this has to do with the difference between what's called a loose culture and a tight culture. And this might have something to do with COVID-19 as well. Why does COVID-19 spread in some countries more quickly than in other countries? Why has it been so strong in Brazil again, and Ecuador, and some of the countries in South America, Peru? But not so strong in Scandinavian countries. I think it has something to do with the looseness or the tightness of our culture.
How do you define those terms, looseness and tightness?
I don't. I think we all know what it's talking about, though.
No,
some countries that really have a big on. The Chinese government did very well with COVID-19 because they're pretty good at locking people up in the normal time.
A looser, tight approach to regulations and government.
And how much people will accept in terms of, if the government, the government tells you what to do, you do what they tell you to do.
Gotcha.
Now, Lara Generous said, drop everything and do another hour. My suggestion is, because I do want to go through the rest of the chapters, that we schedule to do another one in the future. There's a lot of people asking questions on these issues. They're trying to sort out what's true from what's not true. How do I think about these things? I just finished reading Thomas Sowell's book, which he wrote in 2002. It's not a new book, The Quest for Cosmic Justice, which actually addresses all of these issues that critical race theory is posing. And he talks about the anointed. Those who have this vision of a sort of utopia that they think ought to be our lot in life, and all of the reasons why we are deprived of it, and demonstrates, not unlike you did in a post you did in our critical race theory group, that the claims just are not borne out by the facts that we see them in various situations.
Did you get some pushback on that?
To be perfectly frank, now, here's our friend Kendi. As I said, I prefer Kendi to D'Angelo. As thinkers, as scholars, I'm just not impressed by these people. They just don't know very much. They haven't seen much of the world. and maybe they're stuck within their little. Now, one of my professors, I don't think I'll name his name right now. He's an anthropology professor at the University of Washington. I've known him for many years, and I did my research on the True Buddha movement under his guidance, and got my master's degree there with him. He wrote a speech when he retired from his job. Am I still?
Yeah, you're with us.
He wrote a speech when he retired from his job. Now my professor was there very much left wing. He was very happy to quote, Karl Marx or Mao Zedong in a positive way, but he would never quote Donald Trump in a positive way. So he was very much left wing, but even in his speech, he said basically, this political thing, there aren't any Republicans in anthropology, but this political thing is tearing our field apart.
Oh, wow.
How did I get to that point?
So this is I forget how I get to most places.
You are here.
And everybody else is there.
G.K. Chesterton says, call his wife.
You were talking about how the people you read, they just don't seem to have got that much,
He talked about two kinds of scholars. He talked about hedgehogs and foxes in his retirement speech. And the hedgehog is somebody who just burrows into the ground, tries to get as deeply as he can in his own field. The fox is the guy that tries to go from one field to another and try to learn everything he can from different fields. And he himself was more of the fox type of mentality. But there are limits to even what a fox can go.
Right.
And can go in the modern academy. And another professor that I interviewed after I learned that I wasn't going to be able to do my PhD at the University of Washington, and I had to go to the UK to get it, was an historian there. And he is a Christian, but there aren't too many of those left anymore in the academy, in the University of Washington at least. And I talked to him about, why did they decide they didn't want to have me do this work here, which I got my MA here. And he said, at a certain stage in the past, there were a lot of liberal professors on campus, and in their liberality, they decided to, hire some of these radical new young professors in Marxists and radical feminists and whatnot. But then when the radical feminists and the Marxists came to the point where they were hiring new people, they were not quite so liberal, and they just just keep on ratcheting things up. I still don't know how I got there.
And that led to this hedgehog mentality, right? That's how we got to it in University of Washington?
Yeah, and University of Washington is a microcosm, I think, of the academy in general.
Yes, I do. I agree, especially in some of the smaller liberal arts colleges like Evergreen College. You've heard of that one?
Oh yeah.
The more expensive and the more elite it is, I think the more likely it is to go that way.
Well, there have been a few articles in Quillette, which is kind of I
like that place.
I've written for Quillette in the past, one article for them, but they have run a few articles about different programs at the University of Washington and the bias that has come to the fore in recent years.
All right. Well, we're going to need to wrap it up for today. I'm going to ask you if you'd be willing to come back now that you've seen what we actually do in the future, and kind of go through the rest of what you've got in your book. I think it's more layman friendly than a lot of things we could recommend out there, and Christians need to understand these issues. Yeah,
I personally think that there are some things in critical race theory that is good and original. The only problem is what's good is not original, and what's original is not good. But other than that, some of it, having said that.
Yes, I think that critical race theory is unimaginable in the ancient world because they didn't care about the people on the margins. It's the gospel that created an environment
made a difference.
Could care about people on the margins.
Right. Yeah, what did Aristotle say? A slave is a living tool, something like that. In any case, are we ready, Don?
We are. Ron, walk us out of here, baby.
All right. Well, let's give credit to where credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services are provided by Chef Hammond Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Joe Leg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Ivana Pisami. Our director of privacy insurance is Wiretapping, and our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never
not even once. Don't even try it.
So if you can hold on to a second.
The jokes, those are pretty good.
We're going to end the broadcast here. Hold on
Thank you.
1 second, gentlemen.
All right.